And that's why I'm more than delighted to introduce Beth Noveck, who has inspired a whole generation in the fields of open government, citizen engagement, and public problem solving, supported by technologies and data-driven approaches. Beth, you are directing the Governance Lab, the GovLab, and its MacArthur Research Network on opening governance. You're a professor in technology, culture, and society, and affiliated faculty at different academic institutions. Only a few years ago, New Jersey's Governor Phil Murphy appointed you as the state's first Chief Innovation Officer. And German participants might know you as part of the Chancellor Merkel's Digital Council. Previously, you served in the White House as the first United States Deputy Chief Technology Officer and Director of the White House Open Government Initiative under President Obama. At the GovLab, you direct better governance programs, including public institutions on public engagement in lawmaking, like crowd law, expert sourcing innovative solutions to hard problems by smarter crowdsourcing, and co-creation between cities and citizens in the city challenges. And I'm honored to mention that we organize a regular exchange on public innovation learning together since 2018. You have been the author of several books. After Smart Citizens, Smarter State, The Technologies of Expertise and the Future of Governance, from 2015, your current book on solving public problems will be published in June this year. As I've seen, it's a practical guide to fix our government and better understand how to take advantage of technology, data, and the collective wisdom in our communities to design powerful solutions to contemporary problems. That's why I'm so happy to look forward to your keynote. Before I hand over to you, I want to address all participants during Beth Noveck's keynote. Please post your questions in the chat. I will review all of these questions during the 20-minute keynote, and we will follow up with a Q&A answering all your questions, taking in your comments before we're heading in the next workshop. So Beth, it's an honor to have you here with us today. We're looking forward to your keynote on smart citizens and smart cities.
Thank you very much, Carolina. And it really is a pleasure to be here. I have to say that for a conference and a set of discussions around citizen centricity and smart cities, I think everything I'm going to say will be hopefully not new news, but very welcome news in terms of reinforcing the message that the greatest asset our cities have are their citizens and our residents, and everything that we need to focus on is really trying to just build up our own capacity to listen to them and tap their intelligence and expertise. So let me know if we have some slides. There we go. Thank you very much for playing my clicker. And I will dive in and just hopefully illustrate this point with a number of stories and lessons learned from talking to the people who are out in the field really doing this work. So when COVID hit earlier this year, as Carolina mentioned, I'm both in the university and I also work for state government in the United States. We turned right away to an NGO called the Federation of American Scientists, who marshaled a network of over 600 scientists to create a project called Ask a Scientist, where citizens could type in their question. They could ask whether you need to drink bleach in order to cure COVID, or whether you should wash your kitchen with bleach. As you may know, we had a lot of confusion over these messages in the beginning, and so we turned to the collective wisdom of the scientific community to better answer the public's questions, not just through the NGO, but we then integrated this into the state government's website to really better be able to respond to people's questions. It's, for me, and we can go forward, a paradigmatic example of, we can go to the next slide, thank you, of the uses of collective intelligence that we're seeing burgeoning all over the world in the last decade. In 2015, the city of Louisville, Kentucky, and its then new chief innovation officer also used a collective intelligence approach, tapping the wisdom of citizens, in this case, citizens with asthma and COPD, to attach small GPS devices to their asthma inhalers and to better be able to track where incidents of asthma were occurring, not just who had asthma. As a result of this pilot project, which came to be known as Air Louisville, it started with 1,000 citizens gathering 1.2 million data points. The city was able to reduce the incidence of asthma inhaler use in 1 year by 82%, dramatically changing its public health strategy. Let's keep going. These are just some of the examples that we've collected on a new website you can find on the GovLab site. You can also find it on Nesta's website, since we did this work in collaboration with them. And I'll refer to many of these examples as we go forward, but in case you would like more details, you can see them at the URL above, collective-intelligence.thegovlab.org. And let's keep going to dive into more of these stories. So we can go rapidly through the next few slides because they really just ask us to imagine a future in which we think about what it means to govern differently, where we can keep going. We imagine connecting the smart people in our communities to public institutions to be able to solve problems. And that is what makes collective intelligence very different from simply citizen engagement or civic engagement the way we've thought of it before. It's about taking the power of citizens and building it into institutional processes, not simply for its own sake, to talk or to deliberate only for its own sake, still very important, but to really be able to solve problems in a new way. So the question is, how do we do that? And that's where we move forward to look at what are actually the mechanisms for doing so. This is not a new message, and I would put to us, though, it's more urgent now to solve it than ever before. Because with the exception of maybe the last year when people saw an upswing in our trust in government, all over the world, as I show on the next slide, trust in government is low and it's declining. In the United States, these numbers are dramatically lower, of course. You know, they're at the lowest numbers we've ever been able to measure, and they're only going down. So we need to do something differently. We need to work differently in government. And I think that working with citizens is really key to that. Let's keep going. Collective intelligence, and you should be asking me afterwards, and we can talk more about the definitions, but whether we want to call it collective intelligence or you just want to call it engagement, is extraordinarily important, I would argue, to really being able to help us solve problems, not simply more legitimately, not simply because we're using participatory democratic tactics, but also to help us solve problems more effectively. Because we're tapping this distributed expertise, we're tapping this distributed know-how to really be able to do a better job to marshal more information and more hands on deck to solve problems. So let's look more at what this looks like in practice. I'm hoping what we're going to do as we go forward is to really try to understand that there are different ways of doing this, number one. There are very different types of collective intelligence processes, and I'll talk about 3 of them, and that there are specific steps we need to take to define an effective process. So keep going and let's look at what those different types are. In many ways, and there are different fathers or mothers we can give credit to for the origin of these ideas. Obviously, collective intelligence, and again, has a lot of origins in psychology, in neuroscience, in the study of networks. But many people like to attribute or give some credit, at least to Eric von Hippel at MIT, who really pointed out in the management and business literature now 50 years ago, the ways in which companies are actually innovating. And surprisingly, he said it's not only internally, it's actually looking externally to suppliers, to employees, something Toyota pointed out long before this. But really, it was the popularity of this idea came from, I think, a lot of attention in the business world to the notion that businesses and companies are coming up with good ideas by looking outside their own borders. So some of these processes, if we go to the next slide, are familiar to us, but they have slightly different varieties. And I think it's important to be aware of the different styles in order to decide what type is the right type of collective intelligence for us to solve a problem. Let's go ahead and look at crowdsourcing for a moment. This is the one, if we go forward, that actually is the one we're most familiar with because it looks like the kind of competitions that we've seen before. You can go to the next slide. It's the one where people are guessing how many jelly beans there are in a jar, and by the law of large numbers, we're averaging those guesses to come up with the right solution. That's a typical form of crowdsourcing. You can keep going. Oops, we'll stop right there for a second. But it's a competitive process where we're trying to find one right answer. That's not, however, how every process works. Very often what we're trying to do is not to compete against one another, either in teams or as individuals, but we're trying to collaborate together to work on a common challenge. Now, challenge.gov does have 1,000 different open innovation competitions, and it does have a competition element to it. But these are much more projects where people are collaborating on working on a challenge. You might think of very much then the kinds of things that people do online as on Wikipedia as being another example, and we can keep going here. But we're all working together on trying to come up with a better solution rather than competing with one another. So on challenge.gov, you might find something like the challenge to bridge the number of words a rich child hears versus a poor child by the time they're 5. And this is a project that benefited not, again, from people just competing, but then people, again, coming up with new teams, collaborating with the people they were formerly competing with, and really working on solving a problem together. But then there are other kinds of projects that we might think of, and again, there's no science to this terminology. Again, people use the word crowdsourcing to describe everything. They use collaboration to describe everything. I'm going to use these here as terms of art, knowing that the terms vary in how people use them, but to make sure that we're distinct in thinking about some of these being competitive, and some of them being more collaborative, where we're working together on a single solution, and some of them looking like what we'll see if we move forward to co-creation, which is that we are working not on one solution to a problem, but we're sometimes working on many solutions. So you may have many people working on one entry for Wikipedia, but we're not trying to write one entry in the encyclopedia. We're trying to write many. Or if we go forward, we see lots of examples where people are trying, as was the case in Monterrey, Mexico, where they ran a project called Desafios San Pedro, which is a community next to Monterrey, Mexico, to get people to come up with multiple solutions to solve common urban challenges. And again, the project looks very different because we're trying to get people working together, not on coming up with one solution, but coming up with many solutions. So there are lots of different examples, but it's important to recognize that collective intelligence processes will have different levels of competitiveness. They will have different levels in terms of how much individual work versus teamwork there is, and they will have differences in terms of whether people working on a single solution or on many solutions. Let's keep going to see more about how we actually design some of these things. And we can keep going. I have many pictures here of happy citizens collaborating together to do things collectively. The point is that no matter what the process, we have to actually design it. It's very much as Barry Wellman, the sociologist, or Lee Rainey in their book Networked that came out a few years ago, they describe it as being like a dance move, like a set of choreography, that we have to design the steps that we need to effectively design a collective intelligence exercise. Let's walk through quickly what some of those steps look like, and we can keep going here to dive in. Obviously, the first step in any problem-solving process is to define the problem we're trying to solve, to have a clear and compelling goal, something that we can articulate both to ourselves, but that we can also articulate to the people we are trying to get engaged and to help us. Obviously, the more compelling the challenge, the more important the project, the more people are likely to want to dive in and help. And I'll give a quick example here. Yesterday, I was actually attending a presentation of, you might think of it as like a hackathon, where students were presenting their solutions to problems, and they all dived in to tell us about these great solutions they came up with, but none of them told us why the problem mattered that they were solving. So it was very difficult to get excited about solutions when we didn't understand what the goal was of the solution in the first place. Obviously, we have to be able then to identify who it is that we want to have help us and to clearly articulate what those participants need to look like. Are they young? Are they old? Do they have a particular profession? Are they doctors? Are they engineers? Do they live in a specific place and community? Do they suffer from a particular disease? Crowdsourcing, in its original term, refers to really an undifferentiated group of people solving a problem, right? It's anybody guessing the jelly beans in a jar. But collective intelligence really goes a step further to ask us to articulate who we want to have solving the problem. Even if those people still volunteer and self-select to participate, we can establish criteria for eligibility. And those people might include our own colleagues. Very often we're thinking about public engagement, but in fact, some of the most successful projects involve employee engagement, engagement across agencies and departments, and as I'll show you in a moment, in engagement across different cities and across different levels of government. So we have to know who the people are, and we have to be able to tell them what it is that we want them to do, which is not always so obvious. So if we go forward, let's dive in and look at a couple of examples. In both Barcelona and Antwerp, and some of you may know more about this project even than I do, the project that citizens are being asked to engage in is measuring air quality by taking strawberry plants and measuring and tracking. It's a citizen science project, what happens to the leaves over time, which happens to be a very good metric for assessing air quality. But it's a very specific task that people are being asked to do, to get the strawberry plant, to take the measurements, to log the measurements. That's different from what we see on the next slide, which is the example of people all over the world translating TED Talks into their native languages. So we're able to watch all these fabulous talks on TED because of volunteers collaborating, or in this case, working individually, but collaborating across a network to translate talks. Again, very specific task, different from the strawberry plants, and very different than the kinds of citizen engagement things, if you go to the next slide, that we see on this next one. This is much more typical. In the United States, we have a site where citizens can comment on draft regulations. This has been not the website, but the law has been in place since 1946. And since 1994, this website has existed to do a much more typical citizen engagement activities of people commenting. In fact, it's very few citizens that do this. It tends to be large organizations and companies and lobbyists that participate here. But be that as it may, the process here is about sending in written comments. If we go to the next slide, we'll see yet another example. This is something we're doing a lot of at the GovLab. Something we've been doing for years, long before there was Zoom. Now it's become so common. This is experts in what we call the Smarter Crowdsourcing project, meeting together online to work on solutions to hard problems together. Here, people aren't typing in their comments, they're deliberating and talking to one another. But again, it's a very different task than the strawberry plants, etc. So we have to define what these tasks look like. Let's keep going. There are also many examples, especially now during COVID, of people engaging in crowdfunding, of giving money instead of time, instead of comments, as they're doing here in the UK, as they're doing in countless communities around the world through participatory budgeting, to either designate how the government should spend money or to spend their own money towards civic and social projects. So lots of examples, again, that are in the financial area rather than in the commenting area. We can keep going. Oh, I added this one because, of course, this is going on just right now, which is, of course, the hackathon model, Update for Deutschland, another example, again, where people are being asked to write code, to wrangle data. Again, a specific task that we can define for people to do, but we have to be able to articulate what that task looks like. Okay, let's keep going through our last couple of criteria very quickly here. So on the next slide, you'll see the incentives. We have to understand our community and what it is that they're trying to get out of participation. In some cases, it's financial, and we give people rewards for participating in a crowdsourcing competition. But in most of the collaboration projects, people participate for completely other reasons, being part of a community, being able to demonstrate their expertise, or as research shows, people like to participate when they know that their expertise will actually be used and there's an outcome to the process. And I think that's extremely important to recognize as a powerful incentive. People will give of their time if they feel it's useful, and they don't if they won't. And so to institutionalize practices of collective intelligence, to do them not once, but many times, we have to ensure that people understand that their time will be well spent. Let's go on to our last couple of criteria so that we wrap up on time here. We then have to decide how we're going to use the information that people give us. How are we going to judge their contributions? Whether it's a competition or whether it's a collaboration, we have to have some sense of what it is that we're going to accept and what it is that we're going to reject. And obviously, we need to have a clear plan and a clear timeline, as we would with any project, for understanding how we actually move forward. So let's move ourselves towards our conclusion here. What I have on the next couple of slides, and you can just leave these up for a second, are some of the questions that you want to ask yourself in terms of the planning. I won't go over all of these, but I'm happy to share them. But as with any complex process involving a large group of people, we just have to have a clear sense of what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, who's going to do what and when, and to make sure that, again, we're prepared to use what people give us. The worst thing that we can do is to wind up the machinery of collective intelligence without a clear plan for how to make it useful. So let's keep going here. I think I have more bullet points again, and I'm happy to share these, but won't go over them. We have to let people know about the opportunity to participate. Regulations.gov that I showed you before, arguably very unsuccessful because the government doesn't tell anybody they have a right to participate, and therefore people don't use it. So we need to do a lot. At the GovLab, we're very busy today reaching out to hundreds of interest groups to alert them to a new public engagement we're running focused on education in the United States. I didn't show it today because this is an international audience, but the only way we have to get out the word is to ask other people to help us get out the word. So let's go to the end with some final resources that people can find to help them know how to do this. Again, and just to reiterate the point that I made before, we don't always have to use collective intelligence. As important as citizen centricity is, not being ready for it, not having the mechanisms in place, not being organized, means we shouldn't actually attempt it, and it's not always the right strategy. But now we can keep going, Caroline, is if we want to know how to do it, I'm going to point you again to this collective-intelligence.thegovlab.org. You can also find it on Nesta's website. We go over again these questions, and if you go, I think, forward, we have checklist. I'm going to skip. We have lots of cases that tell you about how other people have done it and what they've done, trying to draw out the lessons, especially focusing on collective intelligence projects that have succeeded, like Sin Athena, that has been around in Athens for the last 7 years now, going on 8 years, that has survived a political transition that went from one mayor to the next. We've asked the question, why did some projects succeed and last for a long time, and why have others not? And really attempted to draw some lessons about how to institutionalize that engagement. So we're going to go forward I'm going to skip over these last examples. We can skip ahead to our last. I was going to tell you about one of those successful examples, but let's skip over that. Lots more. You can find this on the website. And I'll just leave this up here again. Lots of resources. I'll pause here for 2 seconds to say, here's one more. If you are more interested in collective intelligence in lawmaking or for legislative institutions, this is another URL with great resources. But otherwise, the collective-intelligence URL will give you everything you need to know in video. And if you don't want to read anything, that's where you can go to the podcast slide, which is where we started to put up audio interviews on Anchor FM. You can also find it on Apple and Google and all these other places if you just want to listen to how these remarkable innovators in cities around the world are using the wisdom, intelligence, and power of citizens to solve problems in new ways. So let me stop with that and say thank you very much for having me, and I'd love to take comments and questions and we're happy to share all those resources. And thank you. Carolina, we can't hear you. And you're still muted for me. I'll be happy to take some comments and questions. Oh, we've lost her. So I'm going to try to look in the chat here to see if there are any. I'm going to try to moderate some questions myself here, and with apologies because I haven't been following the questions.
All right, but here I am. Can you hear me now?
We do hear you, yes.
Perfectly. So thank you so much for this elaborate input, and the questions in the chat, you can find it also in the stage chat, but what I've seen is questions around how do we follow up in terms of we are extracting ideas, we are collecting ideas, but once citizens have co-created one or many solutions, how are we following up these processes, and what is the role of citizens in these implementation processes? Maybe let's start with that question.
It's a fabulous question. It gets me a chance to say the one example that I didn't get to show you. So one of the slides I breezed over was, I'm going to put the link in the chat. Actually, it's 2 different links depending on your area of geographic interest. We have seen this time and time again where people, again, wind up this machinery, get all these great ideas, and then nothing. Because there's no preparation for how to implement this learning. And that's for several reasons. I mean, first is perhaps the institution wasn't prepared to ask in the first place. Perhaps the challenge or the problem wasn't well defined enough, and therefore the solutions, the ideas that are received are just that, they're ideas. But ideas are not implementable. And we all know that if you're working in any kind of organization or institution, we know we need a project plan, we need an implementation plan, we need a budget, we need to understand what resources we need. So that's where it becomes extremely important to combine, to recognize that, first of all, it's very easy to talk about collective intelligence or citizen engagement, but this is a set of skills. And we have to really develop the learning for how to do this in practice, and it requires training. So one of the things we've done very recently with UNDP in 5 cities in 5 different countries in Africa, that's the link I put in the chat, also in 5 cities in northern Mexico with the support of another foundation called the Tinker Foundation, is to work on training public officials. We put them through 8 workshops before defining the problem that they wanted citizens to solve. And now in Mexico, we're doing coaching and training with citizens and public officials together to help them take a project from idea to implementation. So I think the question is absolutely right. And I just want to make clear that it sounds too easy. You see the strawberry plants and you see the cool stuff in Taiwan. You go, oh, citizen engagement, that should be easy. It is not easy. It requires training and requires a process for getting not just the ideas, but the ideas all the way over the finish line to implementation. So happy to share more about those websites for the multicitychallenge.org to explain some of that. And again, it's what we saw with the other projects we looked at, and Nicolas put the link in the chat, is that people really, you know, in Taiwan, they're training people to do this and to use the ideas they get from citizens. And that's a big missing step you just don't hear about. It's like the diet commercials where people are fat and then they're skinny, and this magical thing happens in between. It's that thing that we need to describe about all the hard work you have to do to get from A to B.
Yeah, Paolo is making the comment that it's also about political capital and not only intelligence. In the workshops before, we were discussing that's also a cultural shift, actually, to not only do one thing and then do another thing different. And this is maybe where the question of Niklas would relate in terms of Update Deutschland. From the civic tech community, we actually had a couple of criticism concerning that initiative, because it's basically a kind of incremental optimization of what there actually is, instead of looking at possibly the structural changes that we need What is your, experience with that? Like, how can we actually go into systemic issues in terms of also, if you say people are trained to define the right problems, are they trained to be daring? Are they trained to be courageous? What is your experience with that?
So just the step of being willing to ask, being willing to say we don't have all the answers, and being open to outside ideas already requires a level of political investment and political openness. And frankly, many of these things get started as sort of a, incremental, cute thing on the side. Oh, it's an event where we'll have a hackathon and politicians will take pictures with students writing code. And won't that be nice? But nobody takes it particularly seriously. Looking at the projects, whether it's in York, England, where they're using collective intelligence to combat loneliness, as a major systemic institutionalized effort across the whole city, or whether it's Sinafina, which is not, again, everything across the whole city, but it's a project that's lasted for 8 years and has 450 different projects under it. Or it's the Sustainable Neighborhoods program in Lakewood, Colorado, where they have 20,000 citizens working on 500 different sustainability projects, and now it's spread across 5 cities. I think it takes a level of political risk to begin with. It takes that, if not training, then learning how to do it on the job, how to actually make use of what people do, and the recognition that the process has to solve a problem for someone. Again, if the politicians and the political leaders don't feel that this actually solves a problem, I think it's very, very challenging. And one last point here, I liken it a little bit to how we've thought about open data in the last 10 years. In the beginning, we talked about open data as the right thing to do. Transparency is important. It's the right thing for democracy. But it was very hard to sell that idea. When we started to recognize that open data would help people to start businesses, to create jobs, to create more investment, and again, to solve problems, that's where I think open data became a more recognized tool in the toolkit. So we're still in that transition period between thinking about citizen engagement in the way we've thought about it before. And for the German-speaking audience, I'll use the word here, Bürgerbeteiligung, as a stakeholder engagement, because we have to ask these people, to recognizing that collective intelligence really has a different approach and a different meaning. And this is not about we have to talk to the unions because we have to talk to them, or we have to talk to the church because we have to talk to it because it's required by the Constitution. It's saying, gee, this will actually help us to get our job done more efficiently. And until we get those practices in place, we still have a lot of growing pains.
There's a question from James, actually building on that. He's asking, what is the empirical evidence on that collective intelligence is actually the better approach to solving these hard problems compared to a technocratic approach or a former, like a kind of existing way of doing things? Are there any kind of impact evaluations? Or is that what you are mentioning right now in terms of, okay, we can build a different business, it actually relates to the lives of people, something that should also be part of a broader impact evaluation or a different kind of impact approach?
So I think to James's question, the answer is it isn't always. And I think that's okay. And recognizing that not every project lends itself to a collective intelligence approach, and it's not the better way to do things. We've gone about looking at this. I don't think we're at the point yet where we can say, life, the universe, and everything 42 is the answer to this question. What we've done is instead look at the successful cases. If you understand success to mean having an outcome, being able to measure a change, and having some sustainability to the methods. And that is not the only way to sort of measure success, because you can measure success in terms of whether people enjoy it or they're happy and other things. We're really looking at does this solve a problem? And does the process, do people recognize it as solving a problem and therefore want to repeat the process? So what we've done is back up from projects that have longevity and sustainability and have an outcome. And I will say, there's a side note here, there's great work being done on this in Latin America through the Latino Va Network. And maybe someone can quickly Google that and put it in the chat, but there's wonderful tracking of which are the more successful projects in Latin America. And to really, that's how we came up with our list of questions and criteria, to sort of say, if you can answer these questions, the people who've been successful are people who can answer these questions. And if you can't, it's really not the right way to do things. But again, last note here, not every collective intelligence project is a crowdsourcing project or is a hackathon. We have lots of different models that are more collaborative, some that are less, some are more individuals working together, some are teams working together. So there's still a lot of work to be done to understand that choreography and the different typologies of open innovation and collective intelligence. And we've tried to begin to map out what that taxonomy looks like.
Maybe before we round up in the direction of implementation, there are two questions that are concerning, on the one hand, the communication of participation opportunities, and on the other hand, the voluntary approach versus a paid approach versus something that is more structured, that it has maybe also more commitment. What have you seen that actually taps into these, let's say, more, you also mentioned institutionalizing the possibilities, but also institutionalizing the ways people are involved in building ideas, but then also implementing them. What is your take on that? What have you seen especially successful here?
So I think issues of equity and fairness are extraordinarily important, especially in the wake of Black Lives Matter in the United States and globally. Recognize the extent to which civic engagement processes, and again, some of the survey data that I have in mind is rooted in the United States, because every country has its own non-dominant populations. But here in the United States, civic engagement is the province of wealthy, white, middle-aged people. And if we want to talk about other people being able to participate, we often have to think about paying them. So for the education project we're doing right now, the one we started today is a 2-minute thing. So we're not, and it's anonymous. So that one we're not paying people. But every other stage of engagement we're running as part of that process, we are paying all of our participants. Because we feel it's unfair and it's not equitable to ask, as we did a few weeks ago, groups of parents and students to spend a Saturday with us, helping us to design the engagement. We wanted to co-create it with citizens, but people have to work. And so we felt it was important to be able to pay them. So I think it comes back to this question of institutionalization. When part of institutionalization involves, as we've seen, like with participatory budgeting, why does it succeed, is because it's providing money for people to do many of these projects. So I think we have to not take it for granted that, yes, it's very nice to do civic engagement for its own sake and to volunteer for its own sake. But if we want to democratize who is participating, we need to make it more fair. And I'll give you a quick additional example here. We've just finished some work looking at Facebook groups and the civic engagement that's taking place in large-scale Facebook groups. There's a wonderful group called African Mums in Deutschland. It's one of the groups we looked at where, again, someone who was totally disenfranchised in the real world, so has no political role in German traditional political society, is extraordinarily powerful online, running a group with thousands of people. But frankly, she and many of the other people we talk to running these Facebook groups that sometimes have millions of people in them, that they're running these small cities online, Facebook doesn't pay them. And they feel angry, or at least a little unhappy that these are becoming full-time jobs. The civic engagement becomes very full-time and there's no compensation for it. Again, as these there's many different types of civic engagement and collective intelligence. If you're asking people to spend 2 minutes, if you're asking them to answer a question, maybe you're asking for an hour, not a big deal. But as we get into more extensive forms of engagement, we have to think about budgets for paying people. Sorry, that was much too long an answer. It just, I feel strongly about the equity dimension of this that I think, and I'm guilty of this as everybody, forgetting about this too long.
I think you opened up, or our participants opened up, a topic that we could definitely talk about for another half an hour or hours, which is also the economies around public participation. And here the question of how can startups help to co-create? When are companies coming in? How is that actually leading to a different model of giving input, but then also, manifesting these ideas within a city or within an actual community? So I think we have to take all of these questions in and look at them in a more detailed manner, and maybe can also have your feedback. You're already writing in the chat, prolonging and detailing this conversation.
That would be wonderful. And I will just 10 seconds to say that there are, of course, lots of wonderful examples that I didn't mention in using representative samples of citizens, citizen assemblies, citizen juries. The French are very enthusiastic about citizen juries and citizen assemblies. So are the Scots. So lots of uses of, again, institutionalized forms of representative samples. It helps to overcome some of the equity and representation questions. But we come back again to the question about, should we be paying people, and how do they engage?
Thanks a lot. This was a lot of food for thought, a lot of very positive examples, a lot of practice that we should check out, and we will definitely look at also in building and redefining the Berlin strategy. Beth, thanks so much for your presentation and for sharing your wisdom. We look forward to staying in touch with you throughout the process.
Thank you much. Have a wonderful time. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.